Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I am fantastic. Today, we are tackling a subject that is near and dear to both of our hearts, and it's all-encompassing, this magical tool that's in the cockpit called a checklist. But this isn't just a checklist show about what it is and what's on it. This is more about kind of the how to use it, some of the things that maybe flight instructors don't teach us when we're using checklists, and maybe how we use checklists in real life and don't even know we're using them. And then how do we put all that together to make us a better aviator? So with that, when was the first time you ever remember using a checklist, Wally?
I remember as a young boy, I remember my mother asking if I wanted to go to the grocery store with her. I'm guessing I was about 8 to 10 years old. And I remember going to the grocery store with her. And I distinctly remember at our house, the grocery list was on the refrigerator, and if somebody needed something or wanted something, they'd put it on that list. And then when my mother would go to the grocery store, she would take that list and go to the store. Well, anyway, so we go to the grocery store, and she got the list off, and there were maybe 8 to 10 items on that shopping list. We go to the grocery store, and I expected her to go line by line and pick up every item on that list, and then we would be done. But she didn't do that. We went up and down the aisle, and she was getting all kinds of things that were not really on the list, staples, the milk, that kind of stuff. And at the end, when she was finished and we were heading over toward the checkout line, she stopped, and that's when she pulled out this shopping list and looked at it and just mentally went through it and said, okay, yeah, we got this. And we had, in fact, gotten everything on that list. And it was a light bulb moment for me many, many, many years later that was the first time I saw a checklist get used. And it was truly used as a checklist. In other words, she went through the store and did her shopping, and at the end, she went through and checked things off the list that she had gotten. And she had gotten all the things, so we didn't need to go back and find something that we missed. So I guess the point is, in everyday life, we use checklists. I think everybody listening has probably at some point gone shopping. You made a shopping list, whether it's the grocery store, the hardware store, or wherever. You have some sort of a list. I mean, I've got 3 separate shopping lists at any given day in my phone of different type stores. I have a hardware store shopping list. Oh yeah, I need to get this next time. And, next time I go to the hardware store, boom, I pull it up and there it is.
Yeah, I have a grocery store, Costco, and Home Depot.
Right.
And whether I go to Costco or some other big box store, or if I go to Home Depot or Ace, I know what I'm looking for.
Right.
It's kind of that thing that I don't urgently need, but know I want to pick up next time I'm in there for sure.
Right.
What about flows? Do we all use flows on a regular basis in our personal lives, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I will, with instrument applicants or students, when I'm doing instruction, I will, I say that instrument flying, I say, is a little bit more procedural than, say, working on your private VFR maneuvers type flying. In instrument flying, we learn procedures. This is the way we set up for this type of approach. This is the way we do this. And it is procedural. And so, we want to try to do it the same way every time. And I will joke with people. I'll say, "Are you a sock shoe tie, or are you a sock shoe shoe tie tie, or are you a sock shoe tie person?" And they normally look at me like I'm a little bit crazy, and I'll say, "Just think of how you put your shoes on in the morning. Do you put one sock on, then the shoe on that foot, and then tie it, or do you put one sock on, the other sock on?" One shoe on, and so forth. So sock, shoe, tie, sock, shoe, tie. Some people are sock, shoe, tie, tie. But I'll bet you do it the same way every day.
Yeah, I do sock, slip on. I try not to do too much tying, but you're right. I think I do it the same way every day. I guess sometimes I might leave the shoes in the closet and do sock, shoe, but
right.
It's by circumstance, not by habit, for sure.
Right. Yeah.
We've talked about checklists in the past, but it was more along the lines of being good at them and kind of passing your check ride and doing some other things. I don't think we've dived deep into these human factors or kind of the history of. One of our listeners actually sent us a story about the history of a checklist when we did an episode many, many months ago about using the checklist, but we never did get a chance to talk about it. And I recently got to fly on that B-17 out of Conroe, and it just turns out that a B-17 crash is really where the concept of a checklist came from many, many moons ago. Do you remember that story? Did you read that story at all?
Yeah, I did. It was actually a Boeing airplane back in the early days, maybe even pre-World War II days. And they took an airplane off with gust locks installed. And obviously things didn't go well, and the airplane crashed. And it was actually the precursor to the B-17. I think it was a Boeing. It was called something other than a B-17, and from that the B-17 evolved. And that's when the idea of, gee, we've got to figure out a way to remember to take the gust locks off, out of the flight controls before we take off. And that right there is where checklists were born.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, and unfortunately, like many things in aviation, the policies, procedures, and rules are written in blood for those that came before us, unfortunately. But I'm sure we're all much, much safer today because of it. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, some of the items, and if you really want to dive deep into this concept or these topics, there's a NASA document that was written called The Human Factors of Flight Deck Checklists, the normal checklist. And it's a big document, and it's a lot more than we're going to cover today. But if you're interested in that stuff, we'll put the link to that document in the show notes, and you can dive even deeper into this. But one of the takeaways that I had from that document was that takeoffs and landings equate for about 27% of our flying experience, right? So you take off, you land, and I'll even throw in the climb and descent in that, right? I mean, you're in the process of taking action till you leave the airfield, and then as you're approaching and landing, 27%, not a whole bunch, just over a fourth of our time, but constitutes for about 77% of whole loss accidents, which unfortunately we all know too. We're close to the ground, we make mistakes, and that's where we tear up planes and unfortunately lose lives. But that's shocking that it's only a fourth of the time that we're flying the plane, but almost 3/4 of the major accidents that we're having. And obviously checklists can solve for some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about when you started flying and what that world was like as a pilot when you started flying, and maybe some things that have changed since then.
I think my checklist discipline happened when I became a major airline pilot. Learning to fly single pilot. We were told to use checklists, and I think it was just, you would hear the CFI say, use the checklist. I was never really given much guidance on how to use the checklist. And then I flew for a commuter where it was a 2-pilot operation, and Quite honestly, I just don't remember much about that. But my real introduction into graduate level checklist usage came when I came to work at a major airline, and my first assignment was as a second officer on a 727. 727 was a 3-pilot airplane. You had a captain, you had a first officer, and what we called a second officer or a flight engineer. So the person in the back, the flight engineer or the second officer, basically was the checklist manager, if you will. And so every checklist that was run on that airplane, there were at least 2 people involved in it. So a typical flight, one of the people up front, the captain or the first officer, is actually the flying pilot. And when it came time to run a given checklist, whether it was on the ground or in the air, the second officer and the monitoring pilot or the non-flying pilot would verbalize these checklists out loud. And I later became a second officer instructor, so I was now evaluating and instructing on how to use these checklists. So we became pretty strict about how to use the checklist. I mean, when the checklist was done, you would say the landing checklist is complete, and just very, very meticulous about how to run these checklists. Checklist rhythm. Don't run them too fast. Don't run them too slow. Communicate, speak clearly. But it was in that 3-pilot regime where I really learned the intricacies of a checklist. That's really where it all came to be. Now, in a 2-pilot airplane or a single-pilot airplane, things are a little bit different. I mean, do we say them out loud?
Yeah, I think honestly, I'm lazy when it comes to this sort of stuff, right? I was preparing for this show over the last week or so and reading articles and getting different people's perspective, and watched a couple YouTube videos, and some of the people in these YouTube videos were adamant that the beginning of the checklist, the heading of the checklist item is supposed to be verbalized, right?
Yes.
And I think that goes into the how that we're going to talk about a little later, that I don't remember my flight instructor telling me to verbalize that piece. I mean, it was
Right.
more about, I think you grow into each of these components. You're learning a little bit more. But in the beginning, we're kind of pre-flighting. We don't say this is the pre-flight part of the checklist. We don't announce that. We don't
Right.
announce left wing. And
Right.
you're really just learning how to look at all this stuff. And so then that translates or carries over into the cockpit when you sit down. And I don't remember thinking or verbalizing before start checklist and then doing all this stuff and then saying before start checklist complete. And I my eyes are kind of open to that. This is important, that I need to know that I'm starting and finishing each of these sections, albeit maybe in my brain that I am knowing, but I should verbalize it in any kind of pseudo crew environment.
Yeah.
If there's another pilot next to me,
Yeah.
I should do that, because things can get mistakenly missed or dropped very, very easily.
One thing I had taught myself is, especially with the 3-pilot crew, is to not really move on until I heard the phrase "so-and-so checklist complete." And I compare this, when I was in college, I had some friends that had an apartment together, and we were all music guys, and one of my friends was telling me that one way that he could wake up another guy that was in the apartment with him is they had a keyboard in the living room, and he could go and sit down at that keyboard and play a chord progression. And for those non-musicians, I could go to a keyboard and I could play 3 or 4 chords in a row, and it would feel like it's not finished. In music, we call that the resolution. You resolve the chord progression, and that's how they used to wake up one of these guys. They would go and they'd play this chord progression, and they wouldn't resolve it, and it would just
Drive him nuts.
it would drive him nuts. And he would have to go up and go to that keyboard and resolve the chord progression. That's how I have taught myself with checklist, even at my airline job. If after start checklist, we may do all the items, and until I hear the first officer say after start checklist is complete, I feel like I'm left hanging.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about a lot of things today, and the biggest thing that I want to reiterate is no matter what the checklist is telling us to do, no matter how we use, whether paper or on screens or whatever, the number one thing that pilots should do is aviate, navigate, communicate, right?
Absolutely. You got to fly the airplane. I mean, we can't take a perfectly good airplane and run it into the ground because we got distracted, and there are many. You can go in. There are accidents where airliners took perfectly good airplanes and crashed them.
Some of the saddest dang shows on that air disasters is when you know what's going to happen, and
right.
you see these guys continuously go through these checklists, and you know they're caught up in all the things they've been trained to do, minus that they're taking their eye off the big picture, and it's that we're going to run out of fuel, or we're going to hit a mountain or something.
Right.
So aviate, navigate, communicate for sure. Let's dive into some of these topics. So I think the how is what we decided was the big piece that's kind of missing. Like, how do you use a checklist? How do you hold the checklist? Where do you put the checklist? Like, there's all these things that we don't really learn, and we don't learn them because they're not in the ACS. They're not in the syllabi that we use at this school and other schools on, what does all this really mean? We're taught this action or this thing needs to be resolved by this answer or mechanism, right? So landing light on or off is probably what the action is there, or the step is, and you're verifying, and it could already be on if it needs to be on, and you're saying yes, you're checking it and it's on or off. That's a checklist item that we're taught how to do, right? Fuel on, fuel valve open, mixture full rich, mixture off, right? Those things we're used to doing, but I don't think we are taught. I wasn't necessarily taught the how of it, the underlying meaning of each of these things. We'll spend some time on it, but as required, what does that really mean, and how are we going to answer that question for each other in a crew environment? So first off, I think there is this crew concept, and then this a single pilot, and we talk about cockpit resource management, right? We got a lot going on in the cockpit of these little airplanes nowadays, because we probably all have ForeFlight or some electronic flight bag. We've got POHs and bags of information. We've probably got a Stratus or something like that stuck on the wall or the window or the back seat or on the glare shield. We got all kinds of stuff going on in there. Whether we write or we have an Apple Pencil we write with, we got a lot going on in that cockpit. Where do we stick these checklists, and how do we use them? And I'm a big fan of the knee board, but I don't really like a checklist in an electronic flight bag. I like the paper. I like to have really one operating. Once I'm on the air, once I started that plane, I like one sheet of paper front and back that I'm really probably tri-folded or quad-folded, and I'm using that one sheet of paper to keep me intact. Something else I probably go to for emergencies.
Yeah.
My normal operating procedures are probably on one piece of paper that I actually fold up and stick under my iPad in my knee board, with normally the top half of it sticking out, and that's where I can read my checklist items.
Right.
Where do you, we'll talk DPE single engine world, your Saratoga, where do you put, or how do you use a checklist?
Yeah, well, I guess a pet peeve of mine is a lot of people like to put it up on the glare shield, maybe on the left side, to where it's actually blocking some vision from the window, and that's just horrible to me.
Yeah, the windshield's not big already, so if you're taking 8% of that away from me, I'd much rather be able to visually see out the window.
Yeah, I was just flying the other day in the right seat, and we're on a left downwind, and they pointed out traffic to us. They said, you're following traffic on a 1 mile final advice when you have them in sight. And I looked over there, and right where I thought the traffic ought to be, I just see this checklist. So I just reached over and removed it and put it, whether where I typically put it is just underneath my leg.
Yep.
I'm not a kneeboard person, so I usually don't. I don't have a kneeboard, but it goes right underneath my right thigh.
And there's pouches, maybe a center console.
Yeah.
A place between the two seats. There's definitely a seat pouch behind it, both seats in a lot of these Cessnas and Warriors that fly schools use. But I guess we shouldn't be blocking any of our visual line of sights outside the airplane, windshield, etc. And then it really is personal preference of whether you use an electronic one. I fly a G1000 a lot. I really don't like the electronic checklist in the G1000. Yeah. I've added some things to my checklist for the school and for my personal use checklist, where I just want to make sure I get some tasks done that maybe aren't really even part of the airplane, right?
Yeah.
So it's important for me to have that, but I don't really like the electronic checklists. I feel like they're too almost cumbersome. Like,
yeah,
I don't necessarily have to check off that I checked the stall horn. I don't want to carry my iPad with a fuel cup and all that other stuff, when I'm outside the airplane. So I like paper. Obviously, laminated paper is better, but no matter what form you use, make sure that you've got some cockpit resource management figured out in your how you're going to do it environment. And then checklist versus do list. We talked a little bit about both of those in the intro here, but a checklist is really intended to be a checklist where you're verifying that the things are where they need to be.
Right.
And how would you give us an example maybe of a do list, a flow that is then verified by a checklist in your world? We'll stick in the GA for now.
Yeah, well, typically, a before takeoff checklist should be, what if I were teaching somebody from scratch, I would teach them to set up everything basically from memory using a flow and then backing it up with a checklist. So I don't have a checklist here in front of me, but typically, you're out at the end of the runway, you're number one, you're ready to go. You can do this before takeoff flow. It might involve a fuel pump. It might involve landing lights. Going to probably involve mixture full rich and flaps set as you would like them, usually up, but maybe not. And then go back and go through your checklist. Oh, gee, landing light. I forgot that. Okay, well, that's fine. That's what the checklist is for, to catch those things that you forget. And with that in mind, the checklist will probably say something to the effect of landing light as required. Now, as required is an inappropriate checklist response. We shouldn't, if we are reading these checklists out loud, in other words, maybe we're a two-pilot crew, or for whatever reason you're reading it out loud. Some people choose to do them silently, which is fine. Some people choose to verbalize them, which is fine as well. But we should not be saying landing light as required. We should be saying landing light on or landing light off. We should be verifying, we should be confirming the position of the control or the switch. So, saying landing light as required says absolutely nothing.
Or there's also a term used a lot called as desired. I'm just looking at an old POH now, and very similar. Not sure you're desiring what I'm desiring. We could be really confused if we both had different desires.
Right.
And we both said, sure, as desired.
Right.
You might think that we have flaps set, and I might not have set the flaps.
Yeah.
Just as an example.
Right.
The flow that I remember being taught, and I thought it was a really good one, and definitely needs to be verified by the checklist, but kind of when you spend a little bit of time here on the whole shoreline, this is a busy airport, and you might normally be 4 or 5 in line, and we're probably, got the mixture leaned out for taxi, still sitting there waiting. I like to leave my hand on the mixture so I never forget that mixture knob.
Yeah.
But there's an aspect that I was taught that once I'm ready to go and I'm cleared, last thing I should do is do lights, camera, and action.
Okay.
And lights, camera, action to me was always verify my lights were the way I wanted them. So landing light on, and normally taxi light on. Strobes come on right before you go there, so you're not blinding everybody at nighttime with your strobes flashing. And then camera's really that transponder. You want to make sure people can see you and that everyone knows you're on the go and they see it. And then action really is the pushing the mixture and throttle all the way in to make sure that you're configured for what you want to be configured for takeoff, right? And it was always a really good flow. And if you look at most of these Cessna Warrior checklists, the last few items on that before takeoff checklist are normally transponder set, mixture rich, throttle go, or something to that effect. That gets the same thing done, but the flow is very easy to remember. I don't think I've ever taken off without mentally saying to myself, lights, camera, action.
Right.
Which has prevented me from ever taking off with the transponder set with the code for the person that flew the plane before me, because I've always looked. I've never missed it. Which is the value of a flow, but you can't become 1,000% dependent on those flows, because they could sneak up, and your memory probably isn't as good as a checklist.
And that's another thing you mentioned, a checklist response being set. It may say transponder set, but there's no set on a transponder. So really what we want to say is switch position, transponder on or altitude or flaps. It may say set, flaps. Let's say 10 degrees. Let's say up.
Yeah, no question, because I probably should be saying squawk 12 or squawk code 1200 altitude. That way we know we're ready to go. And the beauty of that, and some of these transponders, a clock will start as soon as you come up off the ground, right? And that probably helps you in all your other VFR work that you've probably put in before you go.
And things have evolved over the years. Now we have LED lights on most airplanes. Probably have switched over to LED lights. So leaving a light on for longer. Back in the halogen light days, we had heat issues. You didn't want to sit at the hold short line and leave the light on for a long time, because it could you could have issues with it getting too hot.
Probably had a 500-hour bulb, and 500 was it. It was going to be done at 500 hours.
So now we have LED lights on most of these airplanes, and it's not as big of an issue.
So what about, you mentioned it earlier, not too fast, not too slow. I don't think we're taught, a cadence or a rhythm when we're learning how to fly. I can remember vividly trying to go fast. I think there was this self-esteem issue that I had where I wanted to be cool. I wanted to go quick. I wanted to memorize and then check, not follow one by one by one. What kind of advice would you have for newer pilots out there, sub 500 hours, that are trying to find that rhythm or cadence?
Yeah, well, the first thing, we go back to aviate, navigate, communicate. The first thing is we've got to stay home. We've got to fly the airplane. We have to fly the airplane. We've got to not put it in an undesirable position. We don't want to crash is the ultimate goal. And where I see this a lot is, first of all, we should never see chaos in the cockpit of the airplane. We should not be there. There's hardly anything that would cause us to rush. Now, an engine failure at 800 feet above the ground, maybe because you got enough time to do some things, but you don't have a whole lot of time. Engine failure to 200 feet, no. You're going in.
You're landing.
And where I see this is multi-engine check rides, is we get out and we actually go through a complete shutdown. And the applicant they are just running around, and a lot of times they do forget to fly the airplane. Hey, we're on a heading of 360. Let's stay within that parameters of that heading. But there is a good rhythm to to running the checklist. I think most of you know that I have a background as a drummer, and I say that as a drummer you're keeping the rhythm. And there is a good rhythm to the checklist. Now, some people's rhythm might be a little bit faster than others, but you've got to find the sweet spot for your rhythm of running the checklist. So when, we talked about the normal checklist being a checklist. In a perfect world, you would do a flow, you would back it up with a checklist. Now, when we get into non-normals, the checklists turn more into do lists. In other words, we read the checklist and it tells us to do something, and we do it. Now, some of those items may have already been accomplished, but we still back it up. Mixture, idle cutoff. Okay, it's idle cutoff. But if you run it too fast, you take the chance of inaccuracy. You run it too slow, and you find yourself becoming distracted because now ATC calls and you get involved in communicating with ATC, and then you try to find your place back in the checklist, and you're not sure where you are, so maybe you skip a step. So there is a good rhythm, and to sit here and say, well, this is the speed that you should be speaking on a checklist, I can't do that because everybody is a little bit different. But I'm going to say this. I mean, this sounds so basic. When you are working an abnormal checklist, you should read every word on the checklist and not add any words. It's just like reading a book. When you read a book, you should read every word and don't add any and don't take away any. And I use the example of paying your electric bill. If you get a bill from the electric company for $171.41, you send them $171.41. You don't send them 42 cents. You don't send them 40 cents. You don't take one word away, and you don't add any words. And that people get bogged down in checklists because they start adding things. They start editorializing in the checklist. They also skip notes. There might be a note in there that says, hey, if you're above 8,000 feet, don't do this step. And we might be at 12,000 feet, so we don't need to do that step.
Well, it's interesting. Some of the stuff that I was preparing for this, the notes in the Cessna 172S model that I was reading, it talked very clearly about making sure the avionics switch is off when you start the engine so that you don't overload that avionics bus and tear up these expensive radios. And I don't remember, I mean, that's probably not noted on a bunch of checklists that have been recreated for flight schools and stuff, right? Because it's in the POH and it's got they write a paragraph about why it's really, really important. And the real estate on that one pager probably doesn't allow that, so you omit it. But it's really, really important that you don't kill the engine by pulling the mixture too much and then reach right back over and then turn that key with all the power to the avionics bus. You cause a lot of damage, and it's those sorts of things that we need to make sure we're aware of and use in the checklist for sure. We talked before we started recording, there's this one common theme you've heard in your aviation career, and I've heard it, but I haven't heard it probably as much as you have, is we can't checklist common sense, right?
No, we can't. Steve Williams, my former boss on the 727 program at my airline, I don't know if he's listening, but he stood up in a standards meeting one day, and we were discussing checklists and how to modify, and we went down a rabbit hole of boy, we could have, instead of 80 abnormal checklists, we could have 680 abnormal. We could come up with every single scenario that we can think of. And Steve he put a stop to it. He says, guys, we cannot checklist common sense. And we kind of started thinking about this. There might be a situation where you are in an airplane and you don't have a checklist for that situation, but you need to manage things. And I talk a lot about, in small airplanes, I talk about fuel leaks. How would we manage a fuel leak? What would we do? Most of these small airplanes do not have a checklist for a fuel leak. So we start getting into the fuel system. What are we going to do? Where are we going to put that fuel? Are we going to put it on the leaking side? Are we going to put it on the non-leaking side? Obviously the easiest thing to do is if there's an airport down there, go land. But what if there's not? So
yeah, that's a tough one because my mind's sitting here racing on what I would do, and I can see myself doing a lot of different things, right? But I think common sense would prevail.
Yeah.
And common sense might change as things got better or worse, right? I don't know exactly where I might go with that.
Right.
But it's something to think about for sure. So let's talk about, I guess, 4 reasons, and this goes back to this NASA document, 4 reasons why checklists aren't completed. And, I mean, I've not done a checklist. I'll be honest. I've skipped that before, but it really is, and I've seen all of these, and then we'll talk about some common errors and wrap up the show. But 4 reasons why checklists aren't completed. Attitude. You ever seen a pilot who thought they knew it all and didn't need a checklist?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Distractions, interruptions. Boy, I've missed things, big things. I've missed big things before. Thank goodness nothing happened. But, you get a fueler come up and start talking to you halfway through your pre-flight. What happens normally?
Yeah.
You miss something. You forget something.
Yeah.
You got to it's kind of like reading a book when you're falling asleep at night. You got to go back and read that page over and over again.
Yep.
Same thing. I think the best choice is to go back to the last known good and start over from that checklist.
Yeah, and just ATC. As you're flying in the air, ATC. You're in the middle of a checklist. ATC gives you a turn to a heading of so and so. That happens all the time.
What about expectation or perception biases here, right? Like the flaps are up. That means the last guy or girl put them up. Surely they're working, right?
Right.
Or in a crew environment, I think you got it. You ever been with 2 people in a plane and something got dropped? It was kind of like dropping the baby. You got him, I got him. You got him, boom, drop.
Yeah.
Big concerns for why checklist items don't get done.
Yeah.
And then time pressures. Boy, you probably don't see people rush because you're a DPE and they're probably doing the 2-hour pre-flight.
Right.
But somebody who's late to go pick up their mom or dad or sister or boyfriend, girlfriend, they're in a hurry, right?
Yeah.
So what are they doing? They're doing the record-setting pre-flight and probably missing a few things.
Right. Yeah. It's a Cessna. We're in a Cessna 177, a Cardinal that doesn't have a strut. So, I asked the FBO to fuel the airplane. I'm in a hurry to get up and
fuel
actually.
Gauge is so full, Wally. They're full.
Oh yeah. The fuel gauges look good. But I've got to go walk 100 feet to go get a ladder to climb up and check the fuel. But the FBO has never not fueled the airplane, so let's just get in and go.
So these 4 reasons why they're not completed cause these common errors, and these are probably things that you're used to seeing or hearing about, right? I did a flow check, but I missed something, right? I mean, our memories aren't as good as a checklist.
Right.
And flows, while helpful, if you miss a step and then you skim the checklist too quick, you're probably still going to miss that step. And I think that we shouldn't depend on flows being the be-all, end-all. This is one I would say I'm probably at fault of, is responding without looking. I think in the twin, there's a run-up section where the headings are they're not colored right. I probably need to fix it, but it says RPMs to 2,000. I say that all the time, but I very rarely reach up and pull the throttles back because there's 3 power settings that you check on both engines. Responding without looking, while in that case is not super dangerous, in some cases that could be really, really dangerous. Gear down?
Yeah.
I probably want to look and make sure that the gear are down.
Yep, absolutely. Flaps 25, 30, 40, whatever you want. Yeah.
We talked about missing things on the checklist. Poor timing. We talked a little bit about cadence and stuff, but I think poor timing is more along the lines of, am I waiting to do my descent checklist to where I've already lost 3,000 feet? Like that would probably be too late, and then I might be rushed, especially if I'm only 4,000 feet in the air.
Yeah.
Before landing, waiting until short finals, probably not the best place to finish up your before landing. I think poor timing means more of that.
Yeah.
And then failure to initiate checklists. We talk about that one probably the most on this show. You got to use checklists. You have to use them, and they're not optional, and they should be from the POH.
Yeah.
Don't be someone that makes the common error of failing to use a checklist. You might not pass the check ride.
Well, the ACS says for every landing in the ACS, it says appropriate use of checklists. There's nothing appropriate about not using a checklist. And
how do you use a checklist under your leg? Is that possible?
Oh, you pull it out. Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. But you know, and a lot of people say, well, I do gumps or C gumps or all the different little tricks. That's not a checklist. That is not a checklist. And you know, and I tell applicants, look, you're in a 172 that's maybe even fuel injected, so we don't even have to worry about carburetor heat. Probably the two things on your landing checklist that are things to do are landing light and flaps. And if you forgot the landing light, it would not kill you. Really, if you even forgot the flaps under most conditions, it would not kill you either. So I understand. I get it. It's not a big deal. But we're not teaching people to fly 172s, because next week you may be flying a Bonanza that's got cow flaps, it's got prop controls, it's got landing gear. Kind of a big deal.
That's a big deal.
Kind of a very big deal.
Might not kill you, but it's going to tear up the machine and could kill you, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, hopefully you guys take a lot away from this show today. You understand more of the human factors around checklists and really why they are around to begin with. You probably use them more in your personal life than you realize, and you should always use them in the cockpit. And while you're pre-flying, make sure you don't miss a single checkpoint on that aircraft to make sure you and your passengers get to your destination safely. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.